Hello, welcome to Timmy Mac Politics with me, Mr. McClellan. We are going to focus on the question, what is the power of European Union institutions? This again is a really common question when it comes to the European Union, equally as common as the question on democratic deficit. And both of those topics, democratic deficit and where power lies within the European Union, are really difficult topics. So students don't tend to do very well on these sorts of questions. If you go through this content with me, as you will have done hopefully when it comes to the democratic deficit content, you'll feel just a little bit more comfortable in answering those questions. So without further ado, let's begin with the Treaty of Rome 1957, the founding treaty of the European Union, and the 6 original signatories very much had an economic focus as their original intent when it came to this European club. And as a result of the European Union changing, it's evolved, not least as a much greater number of member states. There are now 27, and I don't include Britain in amongst that number. Because the European Union has evolved and changed, so too has the power and where it lies within the European Union. That has evolved too. So be conscious of that. And indeed, evolving EU, relative authority of its institutions has changed. And I think that term, relative authority, is really, really important because power is not an absolute concept. If one institution of the European Union has more power, that means the other institutions, by definition, have less power. So therefore, think of this power concept as being in a constant state of flux. It's very difficult to measure, very difficult to quantify. You merely get a sense of where power lies as time goes forward and indeed circumstances change. So there's your introduction. As you can see by the structure of my answer, I have tried to focus on the 4 main institutions of the European Union, but I've also included another 2, just to elevate your answer just a little bit, add a bit of flair to it. Now, you may consider this to be too much content in terms of the time that you will have in the exam, but I always work on the principle that it's better to give my students too much content rather than too little. So obviously, if you feel there's too much content here, just cut your cloth accordingly, cut some of it down, but I would definitely focus on the 4 main institutions. And if you like, as a bit of a bonus, we've got the last 2 here, which I will get to in due course. So let's begin with the European Commission and find out how much power the European Commission actually has. Well, some of its power is diminished because it does lack democratic accountability. There is a lack of democratic legitimacy to the European Commission because its members are appointed, not in any way elected. It is, however, a complex, permanent, supranational executive bureaucracy, and that's my attempt to describe the European Commission in a nutshell. And if we unpick that rather glamorous statement, full of technical language, if you like, you'll be able to decipher where some of the power within the European Commission actually comes from. So to begin with, we can consider this organisation, the Commission, to be a complex organisation. That gives it power because the complexity of the Commission speaks of the fact that it deals with a lot of technical issues. It has a significant understanding and knowledge of the European project, as it were, and also the various issues affecting the European Union and indeed its citizens. Having said that, the complexity of the Commission diminishes its power somewhat. It's always faced with the accusation that it's overly complex and therefore it loses some authority because of that. It is, however, a permanent body. Just like the civil service in the United Kingdom, it is a permanent entity, and therefore that speaks of the fact that its members, its civil servants, do not face election. They're appointed, and indeed you will have career civil servants within the European Commission who have been there for decades. That gives them a huge amount of authority. It is a supranational body, so it concentrates across borders, the European project as this pan-European entity, and therefore that gives it very much a European focus over issues. And it is an executive body as well. It focuses on implementing legislation in practice, how it's actually going to be executed in terms of its governance. That gives it an awful lot of authority, and indeed some of its functions that it does perform are rather crucial. It does have an elected president. She is currently Ursula von der Leyen. That's one of the only elected elements of the European Commission. She is, however, of international repute. So the European Commission president, just like her predecessor, Jean-Claude Juncker, who was very much at the heart of the Brexit negotiations, he became a politician of international standing, and I have no doubt that Ursula von der Leyen will also become that sort of politician in time. She's relatively new in post, however, the president of the European Commission does carry with them some weight, obviously giving power to the organisation itself. And indeed, the role of the European Commission, and this carries some importance, some power obviously is attached to this role. It drafts and executes legislation and the European Union budget. It also acts as the trade representative of the European Union. And indeed, I've got the example here of Michel Barnier. Michel Barnier, employed by the European Commission as the head of the task force when it comes to relations between the EU and the United Kingdom. And Michel Barnier is tasked really with untangling the Brexit wrangle. So he's got a really important job. And of course, much of his focus will be on trade negotiations, okay? So really important functions there of the European Commission, and with it comes an awful lot of power. It, however, cannot legislate on its own, okay? Cannot legislatively act on its own. It needs to work with the other bodies of the European Union. And indeed, consultation, cooperation and co-decision are at its heart when it comes to its legislative function. Cannot do things on its own. So really emphasise that in your answer. The Commission and the Parliament are often involved in bargaining when it comes to the form that legislation should take. So there's an awful lot of horse trading, toing and froing between the elected Parliament and the non-elected Commission. And indeed, the Council of Ministers, the Council of the European Union, has the final decision. So legislation, if it's going to be passed, ultimately has to get the authority of the Council of the European Union. And again, that emphasises that the European Commission cannot do things on its own, legislatively speaking. And finally, the European focused influence of the European Commission has indeed decreased. And what you'll find really when it comes to where power lies within the EU is that there is a tussle between the elected Parliament, which we're going to go on to, and also the appointed Commission. That's the main match-up, if you like, between the European Commission and the European Parliament when it comes to where significant power actually lies. And there you'll identify the most significant change when it comes to where power has moved from and indeed to. So, from the Commission to the Parliament, the influence of the European Commission has decreased, and that probably speaks of the European focus of the European Commission. It tends to operate on a pan-European, European-wide basis, and it's fair to say that in 2020, as I speak to you right now, that really the amount of unity at the heart of the European project is somewhat diminished at the moment. And because of that, the national interests as represented in the Parliament has increased the power of the Parliament. So make sure you get that in your answer. The power of the European Commission relative to the Parliament appears to have decreased, and therefore the benefactor, the beneficiary of that has been the power of the Parliament itself. It seems to have increased. So let's concentrate on the European Parliament itself and where it gets its power from. Mentioned it already, it has democratic legitimacy. Although it's interesting to note that it wasn't until 1979 that members of the European Parliament, MEPs, were elected. And I guess as soon as they were elected in 1979, the amount of power of the Parliament gradually increased because of the legitimacy that is afforded to the Parliament as a result. However, worth mentioning too that MEPs are elected on a low turnout, an average turnout of 50% in the last European Union elections or European parliamentary elections in 2019. And that obviously affects the legitimacy of MEPs and with it the power that the European Parliament actually has. In terms of the technicalities, now this does get quite technical here, so prick up your ears if you like. The Single European Act 1986, which to all intents and purposes holds as much weight, if you like, as a treaty, changed the way in which the European Union worked, and it forced upon the Commission a cooperation procedure compelling the European Commission to work with the Parliament on a more consistent and a more frequent basis, particularly when it came to rules governing the single market, that so precious entity at the heart of the European vision, that single market. So when it comes to the rules of the single market, the European Commission must now cooperate with the Parliament. There you can see the transfer of power coming ever so slightly in the direction from the Commission to the Parliament. Equally, the Single European Act introduced an assent procedure. It's now called a consent procedure. Well, whether it's assent or consent, more power is going to the Parliament from the Commission. And in this respect, the European Council, or I should say the Council of Ministers, the Council of the European Union, now must work with the Commission together to come to a decision, but those decisions must gain a parliamentary majority. An absolute majority within the European Parliament must approve some decisions made jointly by the Council of Ministers and the European Commission. And as an example, one of those decisions which must gain the approval of the European Parliament via a majority is whether new states should be admitted to the European Union. That's a crucial decision to be taken by the European Union, but the Council of Ministers or the Council of the European Union cannot make that decision together with the Commission on their own. It must be approved by a parliamentary majority. You can see power now coming into the hands more readily of the European Parliament. This really has been cemented, this amount of power coming in the direction of the European Parliament by the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, enforcing a co-decision procedure upon the European Commission and the European Parliament. So they must work hand in hand, they must work in conjunction with each other, hence the term co-decision procedure. And equally, the European Parliament can introduce own initiative reports. And that means that if the European Parliament wants the European Commission to draft legislation on an issue, then the European Parliament can create its own initiative report, which effectively instructs the Commission to draft legislation on a topic of the Parliament's choosing. Again, the Parliament is getting just a little bit more powerful. Again, this is cemented, this amount of power coming in the direction of the Parliament by the Amsterdam and Lisbon Treaties of 97 and 2007 respectively, and we have co-decision being recognised as the ordinary legislative procedure. So the ordinary way of working when it comes to passing legislation is one of co-decision between the Parliament and Commission. The two must work together. The Commission cannot work on its own when it comes to the passage and indeed form that legislation takes. It must be on a co-decision basis. And the Parliament, because of that increased amount of power regarding legislative affairs and the form that legislation should take, is now considered to be a co-legislator with the Council of Ministers, with the Council of the European Union. And this is one of the curious ways in which the European Union is set up. The legislative body is comprised of the European Parliament, but also the Council of the European Union, and therefore the amount of power that's come in the direction of the Parliament, it can now be considered to be a co-legislator with the Council of Ministers. And the European Parliament also has a key budgetary role when it comes to the very contentious issue of the European Union budget. It has to approve the budget, its annual budget, of course, every year. And indeed, we've got an example here of the European Parliament rejecting the Commission's budget. The Commission comes up with the budget following negotiation between the Parliament and the Council of the European Union. But if the Parliament does not like the budget that has been drafted by the Commission, they can reject it. And a good example of this, rather kind of controversially, real upfront and obvious example, is that the Parliament actually rejected the 2014 to 2020 budget, that 7-year budget period, received from the European Commission. And the Parliament disagreed with the cuts that were being made to that 7-year budget as considered by the Commission. It was thought that the Commission needed to make real terms cuts to the budget of the European Union to reflect the austerity measures that were really sweeping through member states of the European Union. It would be a little bit unpopular, as it were, if citizens within member states were facing times of austerity and yet they were being asked to effectively pay more into the EU budget. Well, that was the Commission's thinking. The Parliament disagreed with that, broadly speaking, and decided to reject that budget, reopening negotiations when it came to the form and indeed the amount of money that should be spent as part of the European Union budget. So a key power, once again, of the European Parliament. It can reject that budget, and equally, more draconianly, if you like, the Parliament can even dismiss the Commission en bloc, en masse, get rid of all of them, if you like. That would be absolutely unprecedented. It wouldn't be very useful for the day-to-day workings of the European Union, but that power is in the hands of the European Parliament, and I guess there's an extreme representation of the democratic mandate that the European Parliament has, which the Commission does not. Those civil servants can actually be dismissed en masse. Very unlikely, but hey, it's another power play that the Parliament could at least threaten, I would suggest, the European Commission with. The Commission, however, that power coming towards the Parliament from the Commission's actually endorsed the increased power of the Parliament. The little arrow obviously representing that power of the Parliament has gone up. And the Commission has endorsed that probably because it recognises the democratic mandate that the Parliament has. It's trying really, the Commission, to respect some of the criticism, listen to some of the criticism that's coming in the direction of the European Union by accepting, okay, if you think democratic deficit is a problem of the European project, of the European Commission in particular, well, we'll give more power to the elected body of the EU, and that, of course, is the Parliament. The Commission, it's thought, has been ready to accept more power of the Parliament, not least because they share a supranational vision. This vision of ever-increasing integration between member states, getting them to work together more and more, increase the level of integration. I think the Commission is much more comfortable in accepting more power for the Parliament because both those institutions appear to share that supranational vision of the European Union. So effectively the Commission will get what it wants, albeit they'll do it through different means by giving the Parliament just a little bit more authority. However, the Parliament, it has to be said, has difficulty in coming up with a united voice itself, and that's probably because of the different political entities that make up the Parliament, the parties within it. So parliamentary unity is difficult due to national and ideological divisions, and that really diminishes some of the power of the Parliament because it's very difficult to get consensus within there. And that's all the more difficult because the parties in there, they not only have national loyalty, of course, to their member states, but also they have ideological division, ideological loyalty, if you like. And they actually operate amongst 8 different power blocks within the Parliament itself. And as an example here, we've got the Conservative Party of the UK actually being a part of one of the 8 blocks, which was known as the European Conservatives and Reformists, a right of centre bloc. As a way of balance, we have the Labour Party within the UK being a part of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. And those 8 power blocks, those party groupings within the Parliament, emphasise how difficult it can be to achieve party unity and parliamentary unity within the Parliament, diminishing the power of the Parliament when it's very difficult to find common ground in there. So there's the main power tussle between 2 of the main institutions of the European Union. Get that direction of travel, of power from the Commission to the Parliament in your answer. Having said that, we can't forget about the other two main institutions of the European Union. We've got the Council of the European Union, Council of Ministers, made up of ministers representing member states in certain key areas like agriculture, like finance, like trade, whatever the issue may be when it comes to their meetings. It can be considered to be a split executive, the executive body being the European Commission, in terms of implementing legislation, but the Council of the European Union is recognised as well as being part of that executive body. So therefore, it's dubbed as a split executive with the Commission. That gives it power itself in terms of the role it plays. Indeed, more specifically, it coordinates policy and it approves legislation from the Commission. That again speaks of the European Commission not being able to act alone. If it wants legislation to be approved, it will be given ultimate authority by the Council of the European Union. Therefore, this body, the Council of the European Union, shares legislative power and budget approval with the Parliament. You can see the three institutions that we've mentioned so far have to work together in order to get any significant change done. Consensus is often sought within the Council of the European Union, but sometimes unity and consensus is difficult to achieve. States can veto certain decisions, particularly over sensitive topics, and most votes do occur through QMV, qualified majority voting, not quality, qualified majority voting, that principle that we covered in the democratic deficit video, whereby 55% of EU member states must come to agreement over a decision, and those 55% of member states must represent 65% of the overall EU population. Rather complex, but it does emphasise that certain member states couldn't thwart national electorates. So some member states, as a reflection of the wishes of their populations, may want one decision to be made, but that may not actually happen because other member states want another decision to be made. And whenever you get that disunity within the Council of the European Union, you will also have a reduction in power. Disunity in any organisation hardly lends itself to an increased amount of power for that institution, and a disagreement does happen fairly regularly, particularly in recent times, as I'm speaking in 2020, within the Council of the European Union. And as I am talking to you right now, there's been an awful lot of disagreement when it comes to a rescue package for member states of the European Union who have suffered rather severely because of the coronavirus epidemic. That's a current and live issue as I talk to you right now. Disagreement there within the Council of the European Union doesn't help in terms of the amount of power it has. And equally, that disagreement can be significant when it comes to the European Council. European Council being the leaders of member states who meet around about 4 times a year. But they don't always agree on the strategic direction of the European Union. But power, I guess, as a fallback, ultimately rests with the European Council, those leaders of member states, because they will have ultimate approval for any significant decision that is made within the European Union. So the buck stops with those national leaders, and they will therefore seek to hold power to themselves when it comes to significant decisions that are made. So everything ultimately must be approved by them. So they're the 4 main institutions of the European Union covered. Fairly familiar territory to us, particularly if you've watched the democratic deficit video, which I would urge you to do. And here we've got 2 new institutions, at least to us. And we're going to begin with the European Court of Justice, the ECJ. This organisation, I guess like any court, also has significant power because they ensure EU legality, making sure that the European Union acts within its own laws and settles institutional disputes. Disputes, I guess, are fairly common between the different institutions of the European Union. They do fall out with each other, and it will be the European Court of Justice who acts as the referee in those disputes, making sure that those disputes are resolved. So key power because of the work that it does. In that respect, it does enforce compliance also of member states. And I've given you an example here of where the UK actually breached EU law when it came to their commitment to clean air, obviously wrapped up in the issue of air pollution. The UK has not met EU obligations, and therefore the European Court of Justice does have the power to actually levy rather significant fines on the UK unless it cleans up its act when it comes to air quality. Similar sort of situation, the European Court of Justice enforces rules when it comes to the single market as well. And a really good example here is where the European Court of Justice could be asked to hear the appeal, any potential appeal, as I speak to you right now, instigated by Google when it comes to the European Commission's 1.5 billion euro fine that the Commission has levied against Google for anti-competitive practices. That's a huge fine levied at a global corporation, and probably only the European Court of Justice has the power to levy that sort of fine, or indeed ultimately enforce it should Google decide to appeal that decision by the European Commission. That shows the power of the Commission in being able to levy that fine, but also the power of the court when it comes to any appeal that may come its way. And then the final organisation, many students will not have heard necessarily of this organisation, but it's one just to dip into to elevate your answer to a rather unique status. And it's this organisation, Co-Repair, which is French. In terms of a translation, it means the Committee of Permanent Representatives. It's made up of ambassadors from each of the member states of the European Union, and it coordinates the technical work of civil servants, which is significant, involving the work of 250 committees and working parties. Don't get embroiled in the technicality or the jargon of that. Essentially, Co-Repair, these ambassadors, together with all these civil servants, make the preparatory work, allowing the leaders and indeed ministers to make policy decisions. They set in front of ministers and leaders of member states the different choices that they have to make, and therefore obviously the leaders and the ministers then decide. But all that preparatory work is done by Co-Repair, okay, the Committee of Permanent Representatives. They have power because they lay out the choices, do a lot of the research surrounding certain issues, and put those decisions before ministers and indeed leaders of member states. And then throughout all, having done that technical content, we've got our conclusion. It's fair to say that the powers and interactions of EU institutions provide checks and balances. No one institution dominates, okay, and it's worth mentioning that and emphasising that no institution is all powerful. It very much depends upon the matter in hand. Certain institutions are more powerful than others depending on the issue that is actually on the table at the present time. So it all depends as to where really power lies. Hope that was useful for you. A lot of stuff in there. Thank you very much.